Nyali Banjalangni Rakol Jugun Nyali Gani Garama Mala Jugun.
Welcome to Politics in the Pub, proudly brought to you by the team at Ngara Institute.
Our beautiful town of Mullumbimby stands on Bunjalung country. The Bunjalung people have lived around here, loving and taking care of this country for more than 40,000 years. We pay our respect to the Bunjalung people every time we love and care for the country ourselves. Tonight's theme is neither bang nor whimper, radicalism and the end of corporate rule. Our speaker tonight is up there in the world of activism in Australia, and for the last 25 years has taken the role of environmental activist to a whole new level. His expertise and commitment to change have involved monitoring coastal development, protecting the Great Barrier Reef, checking sugarcane expansion, slowing industrial development, protecting threatened species, acting on climate change, and keeping a close check on mining. He's worked as an environment advisor for both the Democrats and the Greens, and spent 8 years working with Greenpeace, working on GMO and food issues, and as head of their political unit. Currently, he works with the Friends of the Earth Emerging Tech Project, dealing with nanotechnology, synthetic biology, and geoengineering, with a focus on corporate influence over regulatory services. He's involved in the campaign against Adani, and because he's just not busy enough, he's just taken on the water mining problem in the Tweed up the road. Please give a warm Mullumbimby welcome to tonight's speaker, Jeremy Tager. Thank you.
We're entering into a world where the corporate state is ruling us. And I call it the corporate state. Others have different ways of expressing it. My vision of that is a three-headed beast. The first head is the devourer, the psychopath. It's the one that dictates the direction and the priorities of the beast. And that's the corporate entity. And the second head is the state itself. And it rationalizes, legitimizes, and legalizes the priorities of the corporate beast, or the corporate head. And the third head is the yapping dog, which is the media, which tells a story, no matter how mythological, over and over again until it becomes gospel. And it's important to remember that the beast is not homogeneous. They each have different feeding needs. So for instance, the head of the state needs us to feed them, which the corporate state needs in a different way. Thinking about the corporate beast as a single entity, I think, allows us to think about the reason why politics has failed so badly. And our belief in the possibilities of the political system. I worked as a political advisor for 3 years in Canberra for my sins, and the belief that we could convince, through reason, the political entity to behave differently than they're behaving was clearly misguided. We face a period of greater corporate control, power, influence, brutality, violence, exploitation than we've ever faced. It's not as though the things themselves are new, but the scale of it is unprecedented. And perhaps unprecedented scales of disenfranchisement, anger, hatred, division. And into this political and social breakdown that's happening. And this is what chaos theory talks about, is when systems become unpredictable, they begin to show signs of breaking down. They begin to show signs of collapse and disorder. And it seems quite clear we're facing that with political and social matters. But the killer in all of this is climate change, or perhaps more accurately called an ecological crisis, because climate change is really the pointy end of a whole suite of ecological problems. And I don't know if if you've read the news in the last year relating to climate change science. The one thing you can say with some certainty is that if climate scientists have been wrong about anything, they have been consistently wrong in underestimating the speed and severity with which climate change is going to bite us. And the news, for instance, out of the Arctic, I mean, every time I even think about what's happening in the Arctic area, I have these moments of panic because it has become so severe. And so clearly we're facing the beginnings of a feedback loop where the system will not behave in any predictable way, but will accelerate and amplify itself as well as the social and political problems that we're facing. In a sense, we all know what the problem is. It is the corporate beast. We know that this is what we need to be dealing with. And what I want to talk about tonight is kind of the intermediate ground between the corporate beast and the critiques we have of those, and there are plenty of them with plenty of different perspectives, and the solutions and how we begin to actively address those. And in that middle ground is what I've come to characterize as really a critique of the left. And forgive me for using the term left, I'll use it as a shorthand for an awful lot of things. Now, my critique of the left involves looking at three structural issues. The first one is organization. Now, within the organization of the left, and I'll frequently speak about the environment movement because I certainly know that better than other elements of the left, but my experience of other organizations within the left say the same thing is happening everywhere. The first critique is silos. Most people come into the environment movement working on specific issues. They come in because of love of animals, love of nature, love of a place that's near their home, something that's special to their hearts, and that's fantastic. But what we see in the environment movement is quite clearly working on issues is not the same as working on systems, and there is no working on systems or on the systemic causes of the corporate beast within the environment movement. In fact, when I was at Greenpeace, we had a discussion where we were talking about coal, about how do we campaign on coal and campaign on the systemic drivers of climate change. And everyone agreed it was necessary. And it became relegated to messaging within media releases, which usually ended up at the bottom of the media release, if at all. It was a failure of imagination in some ways to understand how to combine issues and systems campaigning together. Because we don't want to get rid of the passion of individuals and people involved in issues, but we don't want the issues. Just before Christmas, I was avalanched with emails from people, organizations talking about mainly wildlife. Save the giraffe, the rhinoceros, the eagle, the ray, the pangolin. I got to the point where I started just deleting them because I couldn't stand it. But what it told me about silos is that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of people working on issues that are so obviously linked, and yet they're not linking themselves to each other. For those of you who read Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything, she, in my view, had an overly optimistic view that out of the hundreds of movements that were going on, because embedded in them and implicit in them was a kind of attack on the corporate state, that somehow this would coalesce into a movement against the corporate state or result in the overthrow of the corporate state. I think that's overly optimistic. I think we have to be explicit in the way we deal with the corporate state, not implicit. Second critique is what I call details. We have an abiding, devout, and passionate belief that knowledge is power. And I have a favorite quote from a book called The Science Mark by US academic Philip Borofsky, which goes, a feature of the neoliberal new knowledge economy is the unapologetic production of ignorance. It tells us that the knowledge that we adore knowledge. I mean, I've been in the environment movement for a long time, and people love to know more, everything about what they're working on. They love knowledge as a source of curiosity, adventure, interest, influence. But we make a mistake if we think in the modern era that knowledge is power in itself. It is a tool, but it isn't always the right tool. And I think we need to become far more strategic and wise about the way we use knowledge, recognizing that ignorance has got as much value in the minds of many as does knowledge. So the third critique is what I call tribalism. And every organization has, if it's around for any length of time, has a culture, has an identity. And that's fine, that's great. That culture comes out of that, learning comes out of that. But in the environment movement, as in much of the left, what you see with tribalism is it results in a kind of competition. So there's competition for money, competition for membership, competition for profile, and competition for status. And those imperatives are ones that force organizations to work on supporting the organization, and through that, working on campaigns. And so in a way, your campaigns become mediated or filtered through this filter of needs to be supported. And you see it most obviously really with the Greens, because they have no choice in a sense. They're on an election cycle where if they don't get votes, they don't have power. If they don't have power, they can't campaign on nearly as much. And so they devote most of their time to strengthening an organization in order to be able to work on issues. And what I'm going to suggest in a minute is a model for working together that tries to do away with a lot of the tribalism, a lot of the silos, and a lot of the problems that we face with large organizations. I don't know if you saw today, there was an announcement about an alliance related to Adani. This came from all of the large groups in Australia, so ACF, Wilderness Society, other big groups. And if you look at what's happening in the coal campaign, they have been completely irrelevant to it. And the reason they've been irrelevant is because they're actually not capable of working in the way that movement is working, which I'll get to soon. So the fourth critique, and the last one, is collaboration. The worst of collaboration can be a real problem. I've worked in collaborations that just make you tear your hair out, because you have a bunch of people from a bunch of organizations come in to work on a project, and you can't make a decision or do anything without everybody going back to their organizations, which is always hierarchical, and getting approval, which takes eons, and so nothing happens. The bar gets lowered, and you have to satisfy the most conservative member of your collaboration. In the whole question of carbon pricing under the Rudd government, I was working in Canberra, and it was an appalling exercise in capitulating to those who argued that you had to have carbon trading rather than a price on carbon, because the market will solve the problem, obviously. Those collaborations are the worst, but there are others, alliances, for instance, where you end up with one or two people who are responsible for holding an alliance together. And that works in the short term, but it is not a collaboration that takes advantage both of the differences that the organizations have and seeing them as opportunities. And this is something I keep coming back to in thinking about organizational matters, is we have an incredible range of intelligence, passions, skills, and abilities. And we tend to fight each other over almost everything. Those differences are ones we can take advantage of. Not all of them are going to be useful for particular things. Not all of them are going to be easy to overcome. And some you're just going to have to put aside. But we're not very good at putting aside our differences, and we're even worse at taking advantages of our differences and seeing them as opportunities. So the model I want to talk about actually began in Greenpeace. 7 years ago, Greenpeace was starting their campaign on stopping banks funding coal-fired power stations. And it was kind of a compromise because we were too scared to work on coal.
Or banks.
Well, we tried banks for a year. We tried the big four anyway, and we failed terribly. It inspired no one. It didn't inspire us internally, and it didn't inspire the outside world to pay much attention. So after a year, we canned it, and we decided, okay, we want to work on coal. And one of the members of that climate team went to the US to talk to both philanthropists and groups that were working on climate in some really innovative ways. And he came back, and there was interest in funding a coal campaign from the philanthropists. And so he started putting together a strategy that we began to discuss and went to people outside the organization. And ultimately the strategy was quite basic and quite simple. It was based on two pillars. One was delay, 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 and the object of that was, once renewables reach parity, then the whole fossil fuel industry will fall over. That hasn't turned out to be quite the case, since we've reached parity and we're watching the second head of the corporate beast pretend that coal is still the answer to almost anything. And this is probably one of the misjudgments that was made in that strategy, was, and for me, recognizing that the head of the state is attached to the corporate head is a really important way of thinking about why they don't let go of fossil fuels. It's not because it's not politically the right thing to do or economically the right thing to do. Now, the second part of that strategy was breaking the social license of the coal industry. And I think that's a really important thing in talking about how to deal with the corporate beast. In fact, I'd argue that it is a much easier task with the corporate beast in terms of breaking the social license than it is with coal. Now, those are things that the strategy I'll get to in a minute in terms of how we can begin to think strategically differently. The organizational model that's used by this group is almost invisible. It's not interested in media, not interested in a profile, not interested in members. It has money that it gives to grassroots organizations that work within the strategic framework. It provides training, it provides media and communications assistance and expertise and context. It provides forums for people to meet. So it has an annual meeting every year where anybody who's involved in the movement against coal and gas can meet. And it is it's responsible for strategic development in a responsive sense. So frequently you'll find that you need to change your strategy, or you'll need to amend your strategy so that it is meeting current circumstances. So recently, I don't know if you remember when Adani came out to visit last month, and our politicians, in an extraordinary display of sycophancy, were falling over themselves to find something to give to Adani. So they announced their support for a $1 billion loan through the Northern Australia Infrastructure Fund for building the rail line from the Galilee Basin to Abbott Point. Ooh, yeah. As a result of that, this organization, you notice I don't name it, I kind of feel like I have to respect their privacy. It's sort of weird. This organization convened a meeting up in Brisbane with all the people who are interested in working on NAIF issues or working on political issues, either state or federally, to get together and develop a strategy for dealing with it. So that in a very real sense, it's not tribal. It doesn't put people in their silos. It takes advantage of differences. I had a conversation with John 2 years after it started. And he said, you know, when I first started this, I knew everything that was going on, and I knew everyone who was involved in this movement. And within 2 years, I have no idea who everyone is. I don't know what's going on half the time. And that was something to celebrate. There was no need to control the outcomes in that sense. All he wanted was that people work within a strategic framework, and expecting that people bring their passion, bring their skills, bring their differences to the work that they do. They also adjust their strategy so that it can incorporate new ideas that may be valuable at the time. So they've become quite strong on research and investigations. They've been over to India looking into Adani's record in India, or looking into the corporate structure. They've begun to tease out the fact that they're filled with companies hiding in the Caymans. And in fact, they're asking questions of the stock market because no one knows which Adani it is that's applying for the NAIF funding, because there are a number of those companies. So those skills are all being brought to bear, and people put up their hands and say, I'm interested in doing this. And if it is seen as being within the strategic framework, money will come to them. So there are a few, I think, basic things that I want to point out in terms of developing a strategy. One is, I actually think we need to learn from the right. Now, while we have an imperative or an urgency that the right never had, I mean, they began to put together their strategy for taking over the US political system over 30 years ago, and probably worldwide. We don't have that kind of time, in my view. So, but we do need to be aware of how carefully and how thoughtfully they put together a plan for essentially taking over a political system. Unbelievably effective, and showing a great degree of foresight and and ability to be disciplined about what they were doing. The second is how to work on systems and issues at the same time. I think any strategy needs to recognize that issues matter to people. And if you try and tell somebody who's working on protecting a bush block or trying to protect the koala, no, you can't do that, you're going to fail. You need people who are passionate. You need to get them to understand why working on the systems matters. Finally, I've kind of been playing around with how do you develop a strategy for taking down the biggest beast we've ever seen, and one with 3 heads at that. And I've begun to think about this as sort of a 4-part test that you have to go through. One is, what are the pressure points? Where are the vulnerabilities of the system? Now that's about where is the system vulnerable. And it may be in finance, it may be in tax reform, it may be in social license. All of those are ones that certainly have passed through my head. For a number of years, actually, I've been asking random people in pub conversations and elsewhere, if you were master or mistress of the universe, what are the 10 things you would do to take care of the corporate beast? And what that's told me is that people really struggle with how disempowered they feel. It's as though they've never even, except for some of the really basic answers, and the one I get most frequently is electoral finance reform, which for me is not even close to being in my top 10. And it kind of intrigues me how difficult we find it to think about the components of the corporate beast that are vulnerable. We need to stop talking to ourselves. And in some ways, this goes back to the question of details, and tribalism even, where we become so knowledgeable, so fluent in the issue, that we lose sight of the fact that we are speaking only to ourselves too much of the time. I think that if there's one thing we have to learn from Trump's victory, is the utter failure of the left to speak to the disenfranchised as well as he did. It is extraordinary that a man who represents the very things that the disenfranchised recognize as being one of the causes of their disenfranchisement was able to win. And the left, certainly when Bernie Sanders left, the left wasn't able to articulate how much we have in common, what level of shared purpose there is. And all of the surveys that have been done about the disenfranchisement shows that the greatest levels of distrust in our society, in American society, and I suspect in many others, is distrust of corporations, distrust of politics, and distrust of the media. It is a simple message in many ways, and this is why I argue that breaking the social license of the corporate beast is not that difficult. And it is a really valuable step in part of a strategy to bring it down. So one thing I think is really critical is we need to start coming up with simple stories that speak much more broadly. The other thing we tend to do, and this kind of goes to details too, is we tend not to speak about the things we're passionate about with passion. We tend to speak rationally based on the knowledge that we have. But really, we are in the middle of an existential crisis unlike any that have been seen before. And it is, if we can't speak the truth through our heart about that, then we have a very, very big problem indeed. Thank you all.
Jeremy, it seems to me that our elected representatives seem like a good way into the issue. Why do you think they are representing the corporate interests above the people who they're meant to be representing? In other words, why do they put corporate interests first?
So H.L. Mencken was an early 20th century American political commentator, and he said, democracy is the ridiculous belief that collective wisdom will emerge from individual ignorance. And maybe that is apt, but my view, and this is why I speak about a three-headed beast, is that the political system is part of a much larger oligarchy, essentially. That they are part of the elite and see themselves tied to the corporate sector both culturally and financially. And I think it's far less financially than it is a cultural problem that they are intimately linked to them as being the power brokers in the country. I mean, 50 of the biggest economies in the world are corporations. We're now dealing with corporations that are governments. And I think our elected leaders are now part of a larger governance type, which is the corporate beast, no longer a democracy. I'm sorry, I didn't answer your question about how we can reach them. I do agree that elections are a way of, a form of power that we can certainly use better than we've used it. But I do think that quite clearly the grassroots movements that are necessary to change the political dynamic don't work as they once did. You look at CSG and coal as well. They've won every battle, but still, in a political sense, haven't won the war. And I think it reflects a very much deeper entrenchment of the political state with the corporate state. One beast.
Jeremy, you said that you were asking people what were the 10 top things that could be done to attack the beast. Tell us, what are your 10 top things, please?
Once we have power, and I think the first thing that we need to do, and really what I'm talking about tonight, is how the left can begin to gain power. I think that's the first thing that needs to happen, is we need to actually develop a power that we don't currently have. And once we have power, I think we need to break certain parts of the system apart. I mean, I think a lot of for instance, the existence of a corporate entity is, the corporate entity is a person, for instance. Really simple thing, in a sense, is, and that, I don't know if you know anything of the history of this, in the 1890s, when they were trying to be able to finance the railways, Delaware and then New Jersey deregulated the corporations. Delaware is still the home of corporations. That basically unleashed the beast, and what we've seen since, the progressive strengthening of their power, part of that has come through by a simple legal mechanism of declaring the corporation as a person, and the directors and others are immune from liability in most circumstances. That's one thing that would seem like an opportunity because it seems so obvious when you have corporations that have greater rights as people than people. If Monsanto had been a person, it would have still be serving endless life terms in jail for a variety of crimes all over the planet. So I think for me, these are the opportunities. Whether in terms of developing power, we have the opportunity, we have those particular skills at a particular time to do that, I don't know. I think there's some taxation stuff, certainly a lot of the globalization stuff that needs to be removed so that finance can't move offshore so easily, so that we don't, at the moment, this way the tax system works is that we can't even engage in a tax revolt as the Americans once did, because it's taken out of our wages, and yet corporations can obviously avoid tax and convince the political system that the taxes should be lowered.
I think that dichotomy between the we and the disenfranchised, even when we, here I am using we again, when we speak, is a huge problem. And so I'm wondering, in your strategic, like looking at this strategically.
We as the left need to reach out in ways that we haven't done beyond the boundaries of those we normally communicate with. And perhaps it's a shortcoming of the language, is there is a we, there is a we of sorts anyway. I mean, nobody in the left is the same, and there are a whole bunch of divisions and differences within the left as well. But it was a way to try and articulate that there is a group of disenfranchised who voted for Trump, who don't like greenies, who don't believe even in climate change, that we are capable of speaking to because we actually do have something in common that's really important. I would be happy to use different language. I'm not trying to create a view of otherness that we can dismiss or be contemptuous of, because I think that's exactly what's happened in the past. And I read this wonderful piece in Tikkun, which is a journal in the US, a philosopher and psychologist named Michael Lerner, who said, if we simply dismiss those who voted for Trump as lunatics, homophobes, psychopaths, racist and misogynist, we are making a very large mistake in terms of actually understanding that they have legitimate grievances. And so I'm trying to recognize they have legitimate grievances, but I certainly don't see them as part of the left. I see them as a group or a bunch of people with a shared purpose with us. How to speak to them and how to attract them is a difficult question, and it does mean reaching across a divide.
There are about 200 people here tonight, roughly. What is your message to them? What can each of these people in front of you do to make change? What's the best thing that each of us can do?
I think the individual passions that we bring to our work are incredibly important. I do think that we clearly need to move into a different place if we are going to overcome this dynamic of these ecological crises and political and social breakdowns that we're beginning to see. I think we're going to hear more about the do tank, and I think getting involved with work that is beginning to challenge the systemic drivers of these breakdowns is critical. And how we do that, how we organize, I certainly didn't come here tonight thinking I'm going to be here to start a movement tonight or start a group tonight, because that isn't it. I think there are discussions that need to be had. There are people you need to talk to your friends and neighbors and those of like mind about what you can do. One of the questions I ask myself all the time, and I don't give myself a very satisfactory answer, is how much am I willing to sacrifice? How much am I willing to do to make the change necessary happen when there are no guarantees of any sort? And are we at a stage where we need to act by any means necessary? And in a sense, I'm suggesting that perhaps the beginning of this, of how we organize, which really should be in a self-organizing way, perhaps is about challenging yourself to ask that question of, can I do more? What more should I do? And beginning to think about how you can make your imprint on bringing down the corporate state.
It does seem as though a green left alliance, ALP and Greens, would make so much sense in terms of gaining power. Why don't they?
I don't think the Labour Party is of the left. I think they are welded by the bum to the backside of the coalition, and they are a lost cause, unfortunately. Sorry? They're all neoliberal, that's quite clear. Even the Greens recently are, they're going through their own discord at the moment, and Richard Di Natale felt obliged to speak out and say, no, we're not against capitalism. And it does indicate the nature of the debate that's happening in the Greens, but it doesn't indicate that they are recognizing that they would benefit, in my view, from being more radical than they currently are.
Two questions. One, do you think that the fact that their Kiwi brothers and sisters have now initiated through Parliament that the Wanganui River now has the same rights as a person and kind of corporation, is that the thin edge of our wedge?
I don't know if you know the book by Christopher Stone, Should Trees Have Standing, which he was a lawyer and philosopher in the US, still alive. It's a really attractive proposition, and he was suggesting that I don't know how it's done in New Zealand in terms of how you represent the interests of a river, or how you represent the interests of a mountain or a landscape or an ecosystem. But I think it is certainly an important way of changing the way we think about nature. I can't imagine it happening here, to tell the truth, but it certainly follows on from what Chief Seattle has said, is that these are places that have a voice and they deserve to be heard. I don't know if that's going to carry forward. I certainly hope it does, but there's very little movement for that anywhere in the US, anywhere here as far as I know. So it's I can't see it happening, but I wish it does. That's an answer.
Thanks. The other part of the question was, do you consider that ridicule, satire and mockery the weapons we need to use to bring us all together?
I hope not. I don't know if you know the Doonesbury comic. Going back to the 1970s, he said, "Irony is dead." I think that was when Reagan was elected. And spoof and caricatures just died with Donald Trump. So I'm not sure they're very useful tools anymore. Actually, I think they satisfy a level of anger in us that is understandable and a level of despair. And perhaps we should keep those conversations amongst ourselves. And I don't know that it's very useful to ridicule. I mean, ridiculing Trump may be fine. I don't know that it is convincing the people that supported Trump that he's a ridiculous man. So it's, I think there may be uses for it, but it certainly shouldn't be our primary discourse, I'd say.
I'm wondering whether we could resurrect the issue of false consciousness and the manner in which corporations are devouring the world. And touching on what Tony has said, the movement of law is exciting when you look at what's happened in Bolivia, where they have moved from anthropocentric law to earth law. So the rivers do speak, the forests do speak, and we are moving into ways of a higher consciousness. Would you be able to talk about consciousness in this whole dilemma?
I think that there is a level of personal transformation, if you're not talking about false consciousness, but in terms of consciousness amongst us, there's a level of transformation that we all need to undergo. And I think there are, for each of us it's different. I think in terms of the false consciousness, I kind of see it as the unapologetic production of ignorance, to tell the truth. And for me, that's quite similar in the way at least I think about it. So I'm not sure that I have more to add than that. It's, I don't know how, I mean, it goes to Tony's question to some extent, is the question of, do we ridicule that false consciousness, or do we ridicule ignorance? It may not be a very productive way to go. I'm not sure attacking or addressing false consciousness is going to solve our problems. And I'd add, by the way, to the sort of the Marxist flavor of what I was saying, I think one of the things Marx didn't do was any awareness of the nature of ecology and those systems and their importance as life support systems for us. I think that's a component that makes it far more complex, perhaps far more urgent as well.
The question is, do you see this process, this strategy in terms of evolution, social evolution, or revolution?
When I began to think about this talk, I was thinking of revolution. Certainly not incrementalism. But I began to think too that there are incrementalists amongst us, and this is part of my view that nurturing difference and taking advantage of difference can be really valuable. I think there are people, for instance, in finance who can tell us things about the way the system works within a radical or revolutionary structure that isn't radical in itself. And I think those are ones that we have to be very careful to nurture, those who are willing to participate in a radical agenda but aren't radical themselves.
Okay. It seems to me that the left-green environment in the world is really in retreat, and it's somewhat depressing, certainly in Europe and likely in other parts of the world, particularly as we've seen in America. Can I console myself, have you given thought to this, that this is just part of a cycle, and that in fact over time the people will get sick of the right-wing agenda and move to the left and suddenly realise that climate change is real and we must do something about it, that the economic system is just so unfair, that the growth of inequality between the top 1% and the other 99% is intolerable, that cycle will move on quite quickly? Or am I fooling myself?
I have to say I don't share Naomi Klein's optimism that it is going to happen simply because it's embedded in the belief systems of people who are working on climate change. I think there needs to be a far clearer agenda at work than that. I worry about cycles too, and this is part of why I think we're, because of the urgency, I don't know how many of you saw the projections last year about the West Antarctic ice shelf. They've been saying, basically on a linear model, that the West Antarctic ice shelf was years away from moving into the sea or even beginning, and it would be centuries before we saw the 3 to 6 meter sea level rise that's embedded in that amount of ice. Last year they changed that. They said when it breaks free, it is going to break free suddenly, and we will see 3 to 6 meters in a matter of decades, not centuries, and it's kind of an oh shit moment. Waiting for the cycle to turn is, in my view, not the way we can approach this. I think we have to be far more proactive than that. I do believe there are cycles. I believe that people will change their mind in the face of both climate change and the kind of breakdown that's occurring. I think we have to help deliver that more quickly.
At the heart of this corporate beast is the directors who make those decisions, who press the buttons that make things happen. And I believe that the Achilles heel of this process is something I've always resisted in my business. I've hated to use lawyers, but I have to admit I'm coming around to thinking that's the part. Why can't we bring to bear the force of the law that both exists and can be created to get at those directors for their corporate responsibility? There are two great women on the planet today who are leading this charge. And I just say, if there's activism here, get behind these women and get right at the heart of those people who run those corporations.
I think there's value in doing that, absolutely. But I studied law, and I decided not to practice after a few years because it was so end of the pipe. And because the law in itself is a system that reflects the people in power. It is part of the power structure. So there are gaps in it, there are opportunities in it, but it's like the native title legislation. The courts say you have to do it this way, and it changes overnight. And it has been not quite overnight, but certainly within a few weeks. Those gaps in the laws can be moved very quickly. So I think we have to recognize that the law can be an important tool, but it's not going to be fail-safe, and it's one that is definitely used by those in power to maintain their power.
Thank you. The way you describe the three-headed monster, I think that's very typical of the English-speaking world. But what can we learn from Germany and Scandinavia and other countries that perhaps are a little bit more independent of English-speaking thinking?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I certainly can't speak with any expertise about those countries, except that some experience with, in fact, Kristen Lyons, who spoke here last week, was doing a fair bit of work on the Norwegian, whatever the fund is called, their super fund. Sovereign, thank you, the sovereign fund, and money that was being invested in some really dodgy stuff in Africa. There are problems with corporate influence and control everywhere in the world, I believe. I think somebody mentioned Bolivia before. Bolivia is one of the countries that basically said, no, you can't come in and mine everything just because you want to. But that is the exception rather than the rule. And certainly Germany, Norway, Scandinavia, Switzerland are all subject to enormous corporate influences, even though their social protection systems are far better than ours and far stronger than ours. And I think you can't argue with that, but I don't think that means that the corporate influence isn't incredibly strong in those countries as well.
I think there's a lot to be said for actually talking to, for your left, to talking to our friends who are on the right. And talking to them about issues, not accusing them of trying to persuade them to our political point of view, but talking about actual issues. Because very few people, I find anyway, I very rarely can get into a conversation with people, because I'm mostly talking to people who agree with me. But it would be much better if I actually talked to my sons, for example, who are both in corporations. Sorry about that, but I can't help that. And I find this like a bit of a blank wall, because I tend to talk about what I believe in, and they talk about what they believe in, but we're not actually talking about issues. And we could all do a lot more, I think, on a straight talk to people, just dialogue.
If you look at the coal movement in Australia, which is the model that I was explaining, it has, along with its CSG, they have begun to reach out in ways that are quite unusual, and some of those are quite difficult. And I've done a lot of work, for instance, with farmers, and there are extremely different worldviews. Right, I don't think right and left is necessarily a very useful way of thinking about it. The experience of farmers tends to be very much about an immediate experience of the land that most of us don't have. And so their understanding and way of thinking about the world has different origins, I guess. And if you look in the CSG debate, one of the things that's clearly happened is that farmers and activists have a shared language. And through that shared language, certainly farmers are beginning to think more about the social issues at a broader level than they were previously. So I certainly no issue at all with a movement that embraces as many people with a shared purpose as we can find. And I think we'll find them in unlikely places. This is why the disenfranchised, and they are other, but they don't have to be other. We have allowed that in some senses because we are so tribal in a way that we don't talk to others very well. And I do think we have to overcome that. It doesn't mean we're going to get along with everyone. There are going to be people that are going to be our enemies, I guess. And I don't have an issue with that, but I do think you're right. We need to be far better at reaching out to people with a common purpose who aren't like us. And it's a really hard thing to do.
Don't you think part of the problem with the left, whoever they are, is that it's incredibly elitist in our approach? Why is it that Trump can get the response of these people, or Pauline Hanson, and the research shows it's mostly blue-collar workers who are affected in these areas, like in Queensland, the coal mines and so forth? Why can they get to talk to them and we can't?
As I've said, I think we share more with those we call the disenfranchised than Trump ever will. And yet, we don't know how to speak to those who are disenfranchised in that particular way, I guess. I do think we need, you call it elitism, I call it tribalism. I think they're very similar in a way. I mean, any system that insulates itself as part of its self-identity. Sorry?
Might be class.
It might be class, and I think there are probably arguments that would say, yeah, that's certainly part of it, although I don't think that's all of it. Whatever it is, and however you define it, it's a bit like defining the left. I think you could have endless arguments about how to define the left. I'm not sure that would help us a great deal, except that we need certainly to learn how to speak more simply about the corporate beast that people don't trust outside of this elite tribe that we're part of. How we do that, I think, is one of the things we need to learn how to do. And one of the things about Trump and one of the things about Pauline Hanson is they appeal to the hate side. And what they do, and it's a tactic that's been used for a long time, is get you to hate somebody who is also disenfranchised. It's an extraordinarily successful and strange tactic at the same time. So we're speaking about the franchised when we speak to the disenfranchised, and for me, I think once we learn how to do it, we'll find it actually isn't very difficult to find both shared understanding and shared purpose.
Jeremy Tager, thank you for all you do, and thank you for coming tonight.
Jeremy and I have talked a lot about what can be done. The answers aren't readily there, but one thing is I think we can agree on is that we have a story to tell. That story for me has two very compelling parts, certainly from the progressive side of politics. The first part is that we can demonstrate in various ways the shortcomings and destructive effects of neoliberalism and of corporate rule and corporate capitalism as a global system presided over by a small group of greedy, recalcitrant, largely men who are taking us to the brink of environmental destruction, and they need to be stopped. That's clear for all of us. The second thing is that we have a very compelling story to tell about an alternative way of being, an alternative life, alternative systems of production, alternative systems of consumption, and alternative relations and alternative communities. That literature is out there, that movement is going on. What's really important, I think, and it's really telling, just following on to what Bobby said earlier today, is that I saw Bernie Sanders speaking in West Virginia. Now, we've all got different views about Bernie Sanders and his campaign. We know what Noam Chomsky said about him, for example. I'm quite a supporter. I think he has his limitations. But what he demonstrated very, very effectively is that if you engage in direct discourse with people with whom you disagree, then you can present a persuasive argument and demonstrate the facts and the figures in those arguments, that people will often listen to you. They will take, and those people in that audience ended up the evening nodding and clapping him, and these were Trump supporters. We do need to broaden our argument. We do need to get away from the idea that there's a single answer, that there's a new nirvana that can be discovered overnight. It's not going to happen that way. But one thing I think people keep asking, what do we need to do? Well, we're here, we're a group of people who've turned up, we're listening, we're engaging with each other, we talk, and we spread the arguments and the perspectives that we've heard tonight to a much, much broader audience. As Aidan Ricketts said about a month ago, there are things we can all do. We can join movements, you can join the Ngara Institute. We need all the help we can get to become the alternative think tank to neoliberal think tanks in Australia. So come and join us, you're most welcome. But we all need to do something. My sense about the zeitgeist, the mood of the times, is that sitting on a sofa looking at Al Jazeera or looking at CNN or looking at BBC World News or the ABC or Sky News, God forbid, is not the best way to go. We do need to get up and act, and I think that the times really have changed, and there is a sense of urgency and emergency about the current era, which is compelling us to act. So thank you, Jeremy, for a very inspiring talk. Thank you for your work over a period of 25 to 30 years. You've been wonderful. I'll just announce our next speaker, if I may. And that speaker is somebody, she's, if we have heroes, she's one of my heroes. Her name is Petrea King. Has anybody heard of her? Yeah. Petrea runs the Quest for Life Centre in Bundanoon, south of Sydney. And this is a centre that started off working with women who had cancer. And she was working against the then dominant medical paradigm. And she was encouraging these women not to consider themselves as dying, but to consider themselves as very much alive. And what she encouraged those women to do is to achieve remarkable feats during the course of their lives. And Petrea's gone on to write several best-selling books, one of which is Sometimes Hearts Have to Break. The title of her talk is called Occupying Ourselves. And the reason for that title is that we often think that the way to achieve a different world is actually through externalities, through organisation, and certainly that's the way we have to go. But we also do need to consider what we personally need to do to disembody from some of the influences of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism doesn't just sit over us like a black cloud. We all internalise elements of it, and we have to be aware of it. So Petrea is going to be talking about how we can come to terms with those values that we may have internalised, the contradictions that we live with, and also what we need to do to build more constructive relations in a post-capitalist society.